blue and yellow neon sign of Sparkle Whirl Auto Spa hummed with a frequency that made Julian's teeth ache. A high-pitched mechanical whine that seemed to vibrate the very marrow of his bones. After 6 months of unemployment and a mounting stack of medical bills for a mother who no longer recognized him, Julian didn't care that the job was night shift only, or that the interview had taken place in a windowless office that smelled of ozone and old playground sand. The pay was a staggering $2,500 a shift. No taxes, no paperwork. Just cash in a damp envelope handed over at 6 a.m. The owner, a woman named Mallory, had skin that was as translucent and taut as plastic wrap, pulled so tight over her cheekbones that her expression remained frozen in a mask of permanent, mild surprise. She had walked him through the facility with the mechanical grace of a mannequin, her heels clicking rhythmically against the concrete. The air inside the tunnel was humid and smelled of artificial cherries, industrial lye, and something metallic, like blood on a cold radiator. "The machines are sensitive, Julian," Mallory had said, her voice sounding like a recording played at half speed. "They don't just wash the cars, they scrub the history off them. People come here to lose things they can't carry. Your job is to make sure the cycle finishes. If the dryer doesn't stop, don't try to shut it off manually. The sensors are calibrated to the density of the soul, not the weight of the steel. Just wait for the screaming to end. It's just the friction of the past leaving the metal." She handed him a laminated sheet. It felt strangely warm, with a texture that reminded him uncomfortably of the skin on the back of a human hand. Sparkle Whirl Night Shift Operational Standards. The Ghost Plate Protocol. If a car enters the tunnel with no license plate, do not look at the driver. Reach into the coin-op vacuum outside and pull out whatever is stuck in the hose. It will be a tooth, a fingernail, or a gold wedding ring. Throw it into the tunnel before the car exits. That is the toll for the transit. The violet threshold. The triple foam cycle should only produce red, blue, and yellow. If the foam turns a deep, pulsing violet, the water pressure will drop. This is not a malfunction. Something is drinking. Turn your back to the glass and count the number of brushes you hear hitting the metal. If you count 13, run to the back office and lock the door. The scalp clause. The super dryer at the end of the tunnel is high velocity. Sometimes it catches more than water. If you see long, wet hair flapping against the blowers, do not attempt to clear it. Increase the heat to 180 degrees Celsius and look at the ceiling until the smell of burning hair fades. The infinite conveyor. Never step onto the conveyor belt while the green light is flashing. If you do, you will find that the tunnel is much longer than 60 feet. You will walk for hours through the dark, and the brushes will feel like cold, wet tongues tasting your skin. The 2 a.m. van. If a white van enters at 2 a.m., it will be filled with children. They will be pressing their faces against the glass, their hands leaving gray smudges. They are not real. Do not wave. If you wave, they will ask you to join them in the wax cycle. No one survives the wax. It preserves the scream forever. The skittering limb. The undercarriage blast sometimes dislodges things that weren't part of the car. If you see a pale, articulated limb skittering across the floor toward the drain, do not step on it. It is looking for its body. Point the flashlight at the drain, and it will follow the light home. The silver rinse. At 4 a.m., the spot-free rinse will activate on its own. The water will be replaced by a thick silver liquid. Do not let it touch your skin. If it does, you will become translucent by sunrise. If you see your own reflection in the silver water and it is smiling, quit immediately. The life affirmation. The automatic pay station will occasionally ask for a life affirmation. It will ask you a question about your first memory or your greatest fear. Answer honestly. If you lie, the exit gate will stay down and the brushes will come for you in the office. The first 3 hours of Julian's first shift were a grueling test of his patience. There were no cars, no whispers, and no skittering limbs. There was only the sound of the industrial heater kicking on and off, and the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of a leaky nozzle somewhere deep in the cavernous tunnel. This was the slow burn Mallory hadn't mentioned. The way the silence of the car wash began to feel predatory. He found himself pacing the small office, his boots squeaking on the linoleum, feeling the isolation settle into his bones. He checked his phone, but there was no signal, only a low-frequency static that seemed to pulse in time with the neon sign outside. At 12:30 a.m., the first vehicle arrived. It was a rusted black SUV, its engine purring with a sound like a low-pitched growl. It had no license plate. Julian felt a jolt of adrenaline that almost made him sick. He remembered Rule 1. He averted his eyes from the driver's side as the vehicle was pulled into the darkness of the tunnel. He hurried outside to the vacuum station. The hose was vibrating, humming with a strained, obstructed sound, like a throat trying to swallow a stone. He reached inside, his fingers brushing against cold, wet plastic, and pulled out a heavy gold wedding band. It was still warm, and a jagged piece of skin was stuck to the inner rim. Without looking back, he tossed the ring into the tunnel. The high-pressure jets let out a grinding roar of approval, a sound that was almost a cheer, and the car sped out into the night, leaving no tire marks on the wet concrete. As he walked back to the office, a pale, articulated limb skittered out from beneath the SUV's exit path. Rule 6. It looked like a human arm, but it had 3 elbows and moved with the frantic, clicking precision of a centipede. Julian's stomach lurched. He clicked on his heavy-duty mag light and shone the beam toward the center drain. The limb paused, its many fingers twitching in the chemical-scented air. Then it turned and raced toward the beam, disappearing into the dark, churning water of the drainage system with a wet, satisfied plop. The middle of the night was the hardest. The boredom returned, but it was sharper now. He watched the security monitors, the black and white feed showing the empty tunnel. Occasionally, he thought he saw the brushes move on their own, a slow, sensual sway as if they were stretching in their sleep. At exactly 2 a.m., the atmosphere changed. The humid air turned frigid, smelling of ozone and old playground sand. A white van, pristine and windowless except for the passenger area, rolled silently onto the belt. Rule 5. Julian stood in the small, glass-walled office. As the van entered the tunnel, the interior lights of the vehicle flickered on. It was packed. Dozens of children, their skin a sickly porcelain white, their eyes nothing but dark, weeping pits, were pressed against the glass. One small girl wearing a tattered blue dress stared directly at Julian. She pressed her palm against the glass, and he could see that her fingers had no joints. She began to mouth a word over and over. Join, join, join. He felt a devastating magnetic urge to wave, to show her a single spark of human kindness. His hand began to lift of its own accord. He slammed his hand against the metal desk, the sharp pain snapping the trance. He bit his cheek until the copper taste of blood filled his mouth. Do not wave. He turned his back to the window. He watched the security monitor instead as the van entered the wax cycle. The sound that followed wasn't the spray of liquid wax. It was the sound of 1,000 bees, followed by a scream so high and sustained, it cracked the glass of a spare light bulb in the office. When the van finally rolled out, it was translucent, the windows coated in a thick, amber-colored resin. Inside, the shapes of the children were still visible, frozen in the golden sludge like prehistoric insects. The violet foam of Rule 2 triggered at 3:15 a.m. The suds against the tunnel glass turned a bruised electric purple, thick and oily. The water pressure in the pipes died to a low, thirsty wheeze. Julian turned his back to the tunnel and began to count. 1, 2, 3. He counted the heavy, rhythmic thwack-thwack of the spinning brushes hitting the air. Except it didn't sound like air. It sounded like they were hitting wet, heavy meat. 10, 11, 12. The silence that followed was absolute. He held his breath, waiting for the 13th strike. The office door rattled on its hinges. A wet, heavy weight leaned against the glass behind him, blocking the light from the tunnel. He didn't turn. He didn't move. After a minute that felt like a year, the foam turned blue again, and the pressure returned with a violent surge. At 3:45 a.m., he made his mistake. He was exhausted, and the super dryer began to howl with a pitch that suggested the motors were tearing themselves apart. Julian looked through the viewing window and saw a clump of long, black hair caught in the blower vents. It was flapping violently. He reached for the manual override button to shut it down, forgetting Rule 3. As his finger touched the button, the dryer didn't stop. It accelerated. The hair whipped out of the vent like a living lash, wrapping around Julian's wrist through the small maintenance gap. It was freezing cold and smelled of stagnant pond water. It pulled him toward the machine with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. Julian screamed, realizing he had broken the protocol. He fumbled for the thermostat with his free hand, his knuckles scraping against the hot metal. He managed to crank it to 180 degrees Celsius. The smell hit him instantly, the nauseating, sweet stench of burning protein. The hair shriveled and blackened, releasing his wrist just as the skin began to blister. He fell back onto the floor, gasping, watching as the remaining hair turned to fine gray ash and was sucked into the vents. At 4 a.m., the spot-free rinse hissed to life. Rule 7. The overhead nozzles sprayed a thick silver liquid. Julian stayed back, but he looked into a puddle of the silver water on the floor. In the reflection, he saw himself, but he was older, scarred, and smiling a wide, predatory, toothless grin. He realized then that he wasn't just surviving. He was being changed. The final test came at 5:15 a.m. The automatic pay station outside began to beep. A voice, synthesized and cold, echoed through the intercom. Julian Vance. Life affirmation required. What is your greatest regret? Julian froze. He thought of his mother sitting in that sterile room, and how he had stopped visiting because it was too hard to see her empty eyes. Rule 8. Answer honestly. I stopped going, he whispered. I let her be alone because I was a coward. The machine was silent. Then the exit gate let out a sharp, cheerful ping and lifted. Mallory was waiting by his car at 6 a.m. She handed him the envelope. It was damp with the silver rinse. You did well, Julian. You have an honest soul. Most people try to lie to the station. Julian took the money, but he didn't look at her. He got into his car and started the engine. As he drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror. He saw the gray, ashen mark on his wrist where the hair had touched him. A permanent, translucent scar that showed the bone beneath. He had the money. He could pay the bills. But as the sun rose, Julian realized he didn't want to go to the hospital. He didn't want to see the real world. He wanted to go back to the humid, cherry-scented dark of the tunnel. He drove into the dawn, his mind already counting down the hours until 10 p.m., wondering if the girl in the blue dress would still be waiting in the wax. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was part of the machinery.